Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to all of you in the Open Centre and to Ralph, who gave me an open invitation. When I was travelling through this way, I said to him, I'll be passing through New York, and he said, well, come along and speak to our people and give a workshop. So here we are. And am I okay sitting down like this, or would it be better if I stand up for you? You're okay like that, so I'll see how we get on. Could we have the lights down a little bit? Thanks. And sorry about the problems with getting set up there. My computer, for some reason or other, wouldn't show on the screen here, so we had to, thanks to our friend who sorted it out. And hello to those of you who are in Scotland. Was it 2-3 years ago now? I'm losing track of time now. But people on the island are still talking about your visit because of that spectacular ending we had in their community, the coming of Pentecost on the Hebrides, the speaking in tongues, as you may well recall. And I still get people commenting saying that was an amazing thing that happened. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, I'll make brief reference to it right at the end of my presentation. Now, I've come to this talk tonight on the assumption that some of you who had been in the Hebrides might be here tonight. So what I'm going to be saying is overlapping with that, but building on it. And I'm going to be talking primarily about pilgrimage, primarily about the central theme of my book, Poacher's Pilgrimage here, which is my most recent, and in my view, my deepest book that I've written. I'm going to be talking primarily about the themes from that, but also weaving through it, and especially tomorrow, the issue of spiritual activism. The issue of activism, of engagement with the world for issues of social, environmental, and perhaps religious justice that go deeper than just the normal outward political, economic type of engagement, but which draw upon inner resources, which draw upon the possibility that there might actually be such a thing as a spiritual reality. It might be that we are not just material human beings, but there is a profound level of interconnectedness within us. And that when we touch base with that, we can draw on some hidden strengths that weren't known to us. And I'm going to talk tonight about pilgrimage as a journey into the soul, a journey that is not just outward, but is also inward. And I'm going to do it in some unusual ways. Let me just... for those of you who don't know me, I'm profoundly deaf. And the reason I've got two little microphones on pens here is that when we come to discussion, I'll ask you if you can just speak through these like this, and I control them by my phone, and they play by Bluetooth into my hearing aids here. So that's what is going on there. So I want to come at this from the idea that the multiple crises of our times, the issues of poverty, of war, of climate change, of species extinction, you know, the whole gamut. And not just crises of an outward material sense, but are most fundamentally of a psychological and even a spiritual nature. And that when we understand that, we can work with that creatively, with grace, in ways that are not possible if we think of it only as an outward, largely political battle. So the political, the economic, the social aspects are hugely important. We do all of that kind of stuff, but we don't just do that. We also engage with psychological and spiritual intelligence, you might say. And I mean by intelligence something that is given to us, that is carried through us, rather than something that is just generated in our own brains and is a property of our own egos. In other words, I'm talking about how we engage with our world and with the pilgrimage of our lives in this world. I'm talking about that engagement as being part of how we and those around us in community with us become more fully human. And that we take the challenges of our lives, we take the burdens that we and the world are carrying, and understand them, or begin to understand them, not just as any old burden, but as precious burdens. In other words, when the shit hits the fan, don't waste it, but make compost. That this is where consciousness is at this point in the evolution of the whole Earth's history. And what's happening with us just now is not just coming from nowhere, but for all the suffering that is involved in it, especially for those who have no power in the world, and especially for other species with which we share the world. For all that suffering, there is a deep way in which we can say that this is the unfolding of reality, and that we waste what is happening if we don't use what is happening creatively to generate consciousness, and specifically to generate a compassionate consciousness. So the issue of compassion, the issue of the dynamics of love, the issue of what Martin Luther King here in America called the beloved community, not just as human community, but as community with the environment, community with the divine, with the spiritual world, community with soil, soul, and society. That sense of community making is what we can draw out of these times. That what is happening because we don't have enough of that. And if we want to tackle the issues, we have to create more of it. And because I'm coming from the Scottish Hebrides, which is the islands where I was raised, as some of you know, because we went and you moved amongst the people who had raised me on that island and experienced their qualities. Because I'm coming from there, I'm going to take you on the scenic route tonight. And we're going to go some unexpected and possibly quite disturbing and challenging routes to get there. And the framework that I often use in thinking about these comes from that great Scots-Irish American thinker, Joseph Campbell, who speaks about the hero's journey, which is every person's journey, as being about 3 stages: departure. Well, I summarize them from his writings. I summarize them as being departure, initiation, and return. The departure stage, when who we are is largely who our parents and communities have made us. And then the boat of our lives gets pushed out in the river, and we start to hit the initiation. We start to be buffeted by the forces of life and have to face the realities, the truth of being, at what can be some very disturbing levels. And the point that Campbell and others writing about this make, the whole point that the Bhagavad Gita makes in its understanding of karma yoga, is that what matters is not outward success or failure. What matters is the opening of the Dharma. What matters is the walking of the way of Christ. What matters is the self self-realization, the realization of deep self, where Atman is Brahman, where I live, yet not I, but Christ lives within me, where we are all Buddha nature, we are all parts of the parthenogenetic goddess, the feminine divine, that you can cut it off, but it grows again, it always comes back, because you can't kill the spirit. She's like a mountain, on and on. And you see how I'm fusing different traditions here? Because my particular angle is that these are all different paths up the same mountain. So I'm going to speak in 3 stages, and I'm going to start from where I've just been coming from. The last talk I gave 10 days ago was on the Irish military command and staff course. And when I get back home, pretty much the next one I'll be giving will be here on the UK Defence Academy's Advanced Command and Staff course to some 300 senior military, which is something I've been doing for 22 years now in the case of the British military and on and off at other European schools of war. You didn't expect that, did you, when I said I was going to take the Hebridean scenic route? But we're talking about departure. We're talking about the fact that so many people are born into violence, are born into lives shaped by violence. So let's not be too comfortable, especially those of us like me from a middle-class medical family background. Let's be careful about being too comfortable about how we view our departure points. And let's face the realities that for some people, the departure of their life is shaped by some very brutal realities. I get asked to speak in the realities of conflict module at Shrivenham, at the Joint Services Command and Staff College with the British military. And I'm going to share with you some of the things I share with them. And I'm doing this partly to face the challenging issues of the world, taking war as just one example. And also partly to share with you where I'm coming from, that I have literally just come from Curragh with the Irish military, as I say, 10 days ago, less than that maybe. I'm losing track of time just now. And I'll be going back shortly to be giving this lecture again. So what do I say to them? And in this departure stage, I'd like to draw on something of which I will say more tomorrow, the work I'm involved with urban poverty in Glasgow, through the Galgael Trust. The Gal in Gaelic means a stranger. You get it in place names like Galloway or Galway. The Gal is a stranger, the Gael are the heartland indigenous people. So we're working with the question of identity and how there is something of the Gal and something of the Gael in all of us today. And that we have to learn to become indigenous again to our places, to care for the earth and community where we are walking with it. And I want to just start with part of the Galgael's grace here, that we're cast into a crazy world with many a sore disgrace, where greed o'erturns compassion and respect is laid to waste. That for many people in life, this is their starting off point. This is their departure point. And if it's not the departure point for you or me, for me, it wasn't my departure point because I was raised in a community where I was well respected. If it's not our departure point, if we care about healing in the world, we have to understand it as the departure point of many people. But our Galgael boat here that we built in our workshops is not the only boat that you find on the Firth of Clyde. There are other boats also sailing that waterway. There are boats that carry 300 times the killing power of Hiroshima sailing that waterway in our Vanguard class nuclear submarines. And when I speak at the UK Defence Academy, my brief, as you can see, it's a very surprising brief. It's surprising that the military should ask me to speak on this as part of the realities of conflict. But they asked me to explore the moral implications of conflict that exceeds military capacity to deter or contain it, and the application of non-violence, including its religious basis, to achieve security in a complex world where the net results of conflict are not easy to predict. Now remember, we're talking about pilgrimage into the soul. We're therefore talking about loss of soul and calling back the soul. And I'm talking here about things which for quite large numbers of people in the world destroy the comfort zone of the soul, take away spaces that are hospitable to the soul. So let me share with you just a little of what I say in my lecture to them. I point out that when Winston Churchill was a young man, he rode into the Battle of Omdurman in 1898 up the River Nile with a sabre strapped to his side in one of the last cavalry charges of the British Army. And there you see a military painting of that battle. The slaughter of the Mahdists, the slaughter of the Muslims, was 400 times the loss of life on the British side, because the British side had superior firepower. You know, when you ask, why do people from Muslim countries sometimes fear our countries, we in Britain at any rate have to remember that we have more deeply colonized them than any other part of the world, and often continue to hold injustice in their countries in place so we can keep cheap oil coming through. The point I make to the military is, whereas Winston Churchill began his career as a young officer with a sabre strapped to his side, by the time he finished his military career, this was the technology that was involved. And the headline in your New York Times the day after that happened was this: these are the brutal realities of conflict that are the departure for many children's lives. Even Churchill asked the question with the firebombing of German cities: are we beasts? Are we taking this too far? When I ask the military why they invite me to speak at their schools of war, an answer that frequently comes up is, we need you to remind us of the limits. And so notice that I'm talking here about bridging boundaries, about bridging divides. One moment ago I was talking about urban poverty and being with people who are suffering from urban poverty. I was most impressed last night when Sarah, my host here from the Quaker Institute for the Future, and also running her own theology training program online, took me to a Quaker meeting house here in New York, and their main hall was laid out with beds with homeless people going to rest in it. And I thought, wow, there you see the work of peacemaking happening. On the one hand, engaging with people who have got nothing. On the other hand, engaging with military. When I go there, I tell them why we protest at their military bases, why we protest nuclear submarines, why some of us have been arrested for protesting there. Others are blockading behind me. You can see them blockading the base, preventing entry into it. And that the deepest driver of these protests, at least in the UK, but also at Kitsap Bangor near Seattle, when I visited the Ground Zero Center a few years ago when I was in America, also there, the deepest driver behind these actions to protest nuclear war was spiritually driven, like you see here with a nun and a member of the Catholic workers' movement protesting at Faslane, or like these geisha girls on Hiroshima Day protesting at Faslane. Martin Luther King observed that the pacifist position is not lacking complicity in the evils of the world, but is perhaps the lesser evil in the circumstances. So one of the ways that I use to bridge differences and build bridges is confession that it's not a case of them being the bad guys and we're the good guys, but that we are all complicit in this because we are all members of one of another. We are all deeply interconnected. Therefore, I cannot separate myself from what you're doing. The jet fuel that flew me over here and adds to climate change is fuel that has been fought for in the past and in the present. We've all got blood in our hands. So we need to confess that. And one of the issues disturbing me just now, and disturbing a number of activists, is that the kind of models of activism that have served us well in the past are models that the powers that be are increasingly understanding and working with, bending with the wind. So somebody said to me last night in the Quaker meeting house, but isn't it great that your British Parliament has declared a climate emergency? And I said, it's just words. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, in the same week, they removed the tax breaks on solar panels. So if you're going to declare a climate emergency, what does it actually entail doing? Simply saying we declare a climate emergency to take the heat off because middle-class kids are getting arrested, and that's a bit embarrassing within middle-class professions. Simply doing that isn't enough. And so we're having to ask some deep questions about ideas that things like petitions and blockades and demonstrations, do they still have the same effectiveness that they once had? And coming over on the plane, reading a book recommended to me by one of my colleagues in the Gael Trust, Jehan MacLeod, reading the book that Jehan recommended, I was very struck to read these words by Micah White, one of your American activists, who says, activism is at a crossroads. We can stick to the old paradigm and keep protesting in the same ways and hope for the best. Or we can acknowledge the crisis and embark on a spiritual insurrection, a shift away from materialist theories of social change, in other words, the politics and economics and social shifting of attitudes, shift away from material theories of change towards a spiritual understanding of revolution. And this is what really excites me. This is what me and my colleague, a younger climate change activist, Matt Carmichael, have written about in our book, Spiritual Activism, which is the other book that's available in the shop downstairs while I'm here this weekend. The point I want to make here is that what we're starting to see in the younger generation of activists coming up is something that, it wouldn't be news to the likes of James Cone, whose picture in Union Theological Seminary, whose painting I was shown this afternoon. It wouldn't be news to people like Martin Luther King, but to many of us who, if I can be frank and call us middle-class white activists, to many of our community, the idea that the issue we are up against is fundamentally spiritual is quite a new and challenging one. And the traction that I have for the military, ironically, comes not because I'm trying to play the mainstream activist game when I speak to them, but because I'm specifically challenging them at the spiritual level. And they understand that because, especially in the British and probably the same in the American military, where they've been involved in a number of recent wars, and many of them have seen the blood and guts and had to think about the futility of war and are troubled by that. Many of them have been pushed to think about life at spiritual levels. So ironically, I actually find great attraction speaking to the military about spiritual activism than I do with many secular groups, including even the Quakers, would you believe? I see somebody nodding that they probably do believe. So there we are, that's a military conference. As you can see, I'm in full military uniform, wearing my kilt there. And that's the School of War, that is the UK Defence Academy, or part of it. A part of it that you're seeing in that bottom left picture, a purpose-built School of War at Shrivenham in the south of England. And these are the kind of people who I find will actually lend an ear, at least to giving non-violence a hearing. I'm standing there on the right with a Trident submarine commander close to me. And we actually talk about these protests and why we do them and what it feels like from their end when we blockade their base, etc. And what a lot of them of the older generation, or what's now the older generation after 22 years will tell me, is they say, you know, we're having to think about these things because the world in which we operate is no longer the same as it used to be. It used to be simple when we joined the military. The Russians were over there and we were over here, and our job was to keep it that way. But now we no longer can be so sure what we might be fighting for, or from whom we might be taking our orders. General Sir Rupert Smith says, "Today our opponents are formless, and their leaders and operatives are outside the structures in which we notice the language, in which we order the world and society." Notice the sense of a loss of control there. Even if military action is on a big scale, and even if it is successful, the confrontation will remain to be resolved by other means and levers of power. So you've got the military themselves, at least in a British context. I can't speak for the American military in the same way. But at least in the British context, you have the military acknowledging that war as they have known it doesn't work the way it used to work. In the same way as I'm acknowledging that protest as we have known it doesn't work in the way it used to work. 1 million of us marched against the Iraq war, yet Tony Blair got into bed with George Bush and drove that war ahead nonetheless. You had similar numbers marching here and were similarly ignored. So it's kind of all round, we're kind of having to say things aren't working the way we used to work. And that's where the likes of Micah Jones, who, Micah, what's his second name? Never mind. Thank you. That's why such likes, and you know, he's not coming from nowhere. He was one of the founders of Adbusters. He was one of the founders of the Occupy Wall Street movement. It's not like he's just turned up on the block yesterday. He's got well-proven credentials in activism in saying what he's saying. And when people like that are saying we need to push deeper, we need to push into the spiritual realm, then I think this is a sign of exciting times opening up. And you know, he's using words like epiphany, metanoia, he's using spiritual language in writing for a younger generation of activists. And what I was saying to the Quakers last night is, do we have our Quaker toolkit sufficiently in order so we can help these young folk to resource their activism? Or are we in danger of having forgotten the very tools of which we are meant to be the tradition bearers. So what does this mean for mentorship in our times? What next? What next in the world? Where does true security lie? Is true security about what you can erect a wall to stop? Or is true security about things like climate change? Where should we be applying ourselves? In the case of the military, in every European school of war that I have spoken in, they justify themselves using St. Augustine's just war theory. Now let's remember that Augustine was a bishop appointed by the Roman Empire. He was part of an imperial construct. And his sense of just war was drawing not from Christ, but from St. Paul, in that quote here. That the ruler bears the sword as an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So you have there in Romans 13, verses 1 to 4, an understanding of a wrathful God who appoints the elect, who appoints God's chosen leaders to rule it over others and to hold world order. And that's used by the military to legitimize their use of force. Problem is, Jesus never taught just war theory. Jesus taught and practiced full-on non-violence. Until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violence taken by force. Notice here, until now. In other words, a new order is coming into being. And then Jesus disarmed Peter. Put away your sword, Peter. We shall have no more of this. By cutting off the high priest servant's ear, what Peter did was symbolically stop the man from being able to hear. By supergluing the ear back on, what Jesus did was symbolically restored the ability to listen, which is the prerequisite for peace. And this is where we need a liberation theology to liberate our readings of these passages. So we don't just read a story like that as being a wonder story, a piece of healing magic, but we read it at a much deeper level that shows us how we should engage with the enemy who we are asked or invited to love. So what about the right war? Because just war theory always presumes that this one is the right war. What kind of war is this? And the next slide is very horrifying. It's drawn from one of your American magazines, but not all of you might have seen these images. We know what kind of war this is. This is war. This is what happens in war. It's not just isolated pockets of international hyperventilation, as Donald Rumsfeld suggested when these images from Abu Ghraib came out. This kind of torture at Lindy, England there, that American country girl who got caught up in it all. This is what happens to ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, when social norms break down and the grip of violence takes hold. And one of the problems today is it's becoming virtualized, so that war becomes a form of virtual reality. Fire and forget weapons, killing by remote control, which distances us even further from the suffering. And so here we are right now, President Donald Trump sailing his military strike force into a context that some military commanders say is provocative towards Iran. And what's going on there? Is it any coincidence that Donald Trump is in a bit of trouble? So it always helps a politician to stir up conflict, because as Chris Hedges puts it in the title of one of his books, war is a force that gives us meaning. And when people are spiritually empty inside, when they can't get no satisfaction any other way, looking for conflict, whether it's a boxing match or whether it's international conflict, creates a demonic sense of meaning. And I'm talking about departure, because this is what shapes the departure of so many people's lives. Walking through Govan, the part of Glasgow in which I live, which is a hard-pressed former shipbuilding area, and seeing the faces of so many broken people. Walking through the Bronx yesterday and seeing so many people who should be being cared for, but the walking wounded on the streets. This is the kind of starting point that enables the spiral of violence to keep on tightening in the world, because war is not healthy for children and other living things. Initiation. So if departure is how you start your life, how the boat of your life is pushed out of the river, initiation is when we start hitting the rocks and the rapids, and we realize just how deep and cold the water is. And we can find ourselves very alone. And the name of the game, Joseph Campbell points out, or that any good shamanic teacher would point out, the name of the game is that you build courage, that you build strength of heart. So initiation. Let us examine more deeply the situation we are in just now, and specifically the situation between the tiny island of Lewis, where I grew up and was educated, and the United States of America. Some of you will have heard of West Papua and the political situation there. I don't want to say too much about that on public record here, but you will know that it began with Dutch colonization and has gone on through the Indonesian dictatorship. The political situation now changing somewhat with Joko in power, enabling my wife and I 3 weeks ago to bring to the Isle of Lewis and Harris that you see circled there a group of a dozen or so village leaders from West Papua province, building on earlier work we had done with civil servants in the provincial government and some of the politicians from that part of the world. So imagine, here are people who have historically been deeply colonized in order to strip out their natural resources. And we're bringing them to my village. And I'm standing there with some of the village, two of the village women, with Mary Catherine McLean on the left there, and Evelyn Cool MacLeod on the right. And I'm standing at the head of Loch Lurbost, the head of the sea loch, the arm of the sea at our village, at a place called Croiggery. And you'll see we've got a big cooking pot there, and we're making a fire. Because that's where since I was a small boy, we would go and gather shellfish, cockles and mussels. And so imagine it, 3 weeks ago, and we've got these folk from West Papua, and I've taken them back to the village. And notice we're standing in ruins that as children we used to play in. And nobody ever told us the story of these ruins, because most people didn't know the story. The story had been obliterated. Because when we're talking about violence, we're talking about amnesia. And those of you with a background in psychotherapy know that violence renders people senseless. But something in the soul always knows. And something in the soul cannot be free until that knowledge is opened out. And so I took them there to pose a number of questions. Why are the village fishing boats rotting? They're rotting because we've lost control of our fisheries. And there's hardly any fish left now. Notice the coastline there. Notice how the land is chipped away. Why is what is previously, there were raised beds, Fiannagan, the raised beds, that's why you've got that indented pattern. Why is our coastline being eaten away all around the island? The coastline is being eaten away all around the island because since we were small boys, I'm 63 now, since I was maybe 50 plus years ago, the sea level has risen by 5 inches because of global warming, combined with storm surges from the extreme weather events that we're having, and all around the place we are losing coastline. And there you see it, there you see what it looks like as land that had been made rich by human labor bringing seaweed and dung onto it is now, that's maybe moved back about 20, 30 feet since I was a boy. And it's going all the time. And we're talking about these ruins that we used to play in. What were these ruins? And why is it that everybody lives on the left-hand side of the sea loch there, and there's nobody at all living on the right-hand side, although there are several sites with ruined villages? So why does one side have human population today, where I went to school down over that hill, and the other side doesn't? We never asked these questions when we were children. And when I said to a school teacher a few years ago, why did you not teach us this history? He answered, well, it was not in the curriculum. And in any case, we were ashamed of it. This is what happens when you're living on the native reservation. When you're living on the native reservation, it's not in the curriculum. And in any case, you're ashamed of it. This is what happened until recently. I am sure, I can't speak for sure because I'm not well enough informed of America, but I would imagine that many African Americans were not taught their true history until recently. And part of the reason was that they would have internalized the shame of it, because when you are rendered senseless by violence, it can be very hard to carry your history. That's certainly our experience on the island here. So what did we do with the Papuans 3 weeks ago? Well, the reason that I asked my friends if they would bring a cooking pot and some firewood is that as we walked across to those ruins, there you see the village in the background. As we walked across to the other side of the sea loch, we gathered shellfish, that's a sort of rock there, covered with mussels. and we filled the pot with mussels and cockles, and we cooked them up. And then Evelyn and Mary Catherine and Shawnee MacDonald, nicknamed Rusty because he was a village blacksmith, who I went to school with when we were 4 years old, started to tell the story that has only recently been uncovered. And only recently are people talking about it, and some families saying, well, it was always passed on in our family, but whispered about. And the story, to cut it short, is a story replicated across much of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, indeed through lowland Scotland, across Ireland, and further back in time across England, and many other parts of Europe. But it's remembered in Scotland more readily because it was so close to history. You can still see ruins like I've shown you. And to cut it short there, Colonel Francis Humberston Mackenzie, whose forebears had been granted the whole of the Isle of Lewis for services as part of the internal colonisation of the British state, of bringing parts of Britain into the British state that had been on the fringes. Humberston Mackenzie was asked by the British state to raise a regiment to fight for the empire. He asked for volunteers, he didn't get many, so he sent in the press gangs. And entire generations of young men were kidnapped from the villages on our island. In the 1800s, the late 1700s, early 1800s, and sent off to fight for the British Army, many of them never coming back again. To thank him, the British state made him Governor General of the Barbados, commencing round about 1801 for several years. But he ran up huge gambling debts, and to pay his debts, he issued orders to evict the tenants and to lease out the land for sheep farming. His daughter then inherited the estate and continued the evictions, but she had developed the evangelical religion in a particularly hardline way, and brought in from the mainland hand-picked hardline clergy, beginning with the Reverend Alexander MacLeod here in 1824, who explicitly used fear to drive conversion into his form of hardline born-again type evangelicalism that you know in America here. So mark that it was the landlords who introduced this hardline form of evangelical religion. And this particular form of religion, based on the teachings of John Calvin, teaches that human nature is totally depraved. Some of us, however, are the elect, so a small number of us are God's elect. We are the ones appointed to rule over the city on the hill that governs the rest of you, the great unwashed, the reprobate, the damned. In a context of limited atonement, meaning Jesus died not for you lot, but only for us lot, to save us from our sins. So as Patti Smith, the godmother of American punk, put it, Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine. And I'll leave the other bits out of that. But that's a key point, that what you have in this form of religious teaching is divide and rule incarnate. You have a binary worldview that divides humankind between the in-group and the out-group. Note that. Note that. And think about what happens when that gets turbocharged with political boosters. So the people got kicked off the land. That's why you get so many Macs, or from Ireland, the O's, in your telephone directories. People got kicked off the land, went off to America. Here's one example of a young woman, not directly kicked off the land, but her forebears, Mary Ann MacLeod's forebears, she died only in 2000. Her forebears on two sides of her family line had been evicted by Mackenzie in the 1800s and pushed onto a tiny area of land. And just to take her as one example, she suffered, sitting down and talking about it with islanders, we've counted 7 layers of trauma. First of all, the historic trauma of being uprooted from your traditional place. Secondly, they were moved, or they had to flee to another part of the island where they lived the first winter in their upturned boats because they had no shelter. And many of them died. The conditions were described by a contemporary chronicler in appalling terms. And when they did settle from that, many of their young men drowned regularly in fishing tragedies because they were in an exposed area of coast. And then thirdly, in the Great War, 1 in 5 of the island's young men died. Fourth, as 200 of them were coming home on New Year's Day 1919, exactly 100 years ago, their ship hit rocks and they drowned, just offshore, just off from the village where Mary Ann was growing up, the village of Ayrtown. So literally they were walking around picking up bodies. And their theology was telling them that this was God's punishment for human sin. Even this year, one minister on the island, condemned by most others, but nevertheless one saying, this happened because of human sin. This was our punishment. And then next they got hit by the Spanish flu because the island had little resistance to it. And then by the tuberculosis, so we're up to 6 levels of trauma now. The tuberculosis also brought back from the trenches with strains that they had no resistance to. And then mass emigration, because the young were giving up hope. The young were emigrating to America. In 1923 alone, when Mary Ann was 11 years old, 1,000 people emigrated from the island of 30,000 people. And 4/5 of them were young men. So there was nobody left for a bonny young lass like her to marry. So what did she do? She emigrated to America and became Mrs. Trump. She met Frederick Christ Trump, and the Donald John, one of the most common island names, Dol Nian in Gaelic, was the outcome. And so the story I'm telling you is a little bit different from the usual Trump bashing. Because the story I'm telling you is that if we want to understand what is going on, we hear a lot about his father's side, but in the American biographies that I've seen virtually nothing about his mother's side, except she was from Scotland, and he had a Hebridean nanny. So there were 2 island women in his life. He came back before the election to visit the family house and to visit his cousins there, and he spent exactly 90 seconds inside the house because he only wanted the photo shot before he cleared off on his golden jet. Sarah and I have just been visiting a woman who lives in Manhattan not from the Isle of Lewis, but from the West Highlands. And she was saying how she was up in Stornoway and was being introduced to Donald Trump's relatives. And she said to a friend, how do they feel about it? And was told, oh, they're just so ashamed. Because this is the antithesis of the island way. So there we are, we're sitting there. And Rusty and Evelyn and Mary Catherine are telling these stories to the West Papuans. And Rusty is saying, and Mary Evelyn is nodding agreement also. He says, and I am also descended from that same family of Donald Trump's. So I am one of his distant cousins. We're talking about initiation. We're talking about what it means to really deeply face the issues that shape our times and shape ourselves. There's the village of Burnish from which they were actually evicted, where the Smith family in Trump's maternal line was evicted from. And if you look on that map, you can see at various places ruin, ruin, ruins, ruin, ruins. You go onto Google Earth, and you look at it, and there you see it. The line you see going through is a deerstalker's path. I know it well because I used to be a deerstalker's pony boy in my youth. You can see some of the ruins on the coast there, and you can see other ruins scattered around. The lines all over the map, remember that indented pattern you saw where the climate change was eating away? That's the Fiannagan, the raised beds of the cultivation. Those are the fields that Donald Trump's forebears were fed from. And today you go there, like I went back a few years ago and went out as a pony boy again just to see what it was like again. And there we are just above Donald Trump's ancestors' village. Nobody living there now. The grazing's gone back to moorlands. But that is the land of Donald Trump's maternal ancestors. And when we said to the old woman we visited just now, literally 2 hours ago, to what do you think Donald Trump owes his success? She said something, you can correct me if I get it wrong, Sarah. But she basically said, well, he knows how to connect with people because he's got the island in him. Does that reasonably accurately summarize it? And I said, that's exactly my analysis. That Donald Trump understands the theology because it was a theology he learned on his mother's knee. He attributes his religion to his mother. He understands a theology which, remember, is a theology of a binary divide between the damned and the elect. But he also has got the common touch with which to communicate to people who have led hard-pressed lives. He knows how to play with fear like those clergy played with fear. And why the obsession was making America great. You only have an obsession with being great if there is something deeply, if you're carrying some deep sense of inferiority, if you're carrying some deep shame, if you're carrying some deep suffering that hasn't been acknowledged. And he's picking up on that in his constituency. I'm not saying it's because Donald Trump has experienced that we see what's happening in American politics. But I am suggesting that he carries something in him which is able to connect with that constituency in American politics. And therefore the wall with Mexico is a binary divide, a wall that runs through Donald Trump's mind. And as we discussed with our host 2 hours ago, the point about Donald Trump is that unlike one of the island boys, unlike me or Rusty, we were raised in the basket of community. We were held by the neighborhood. We were taught how to be decent human beings. But the Donald understands how to connect with people, but maybe not with real empathy. How did I manage that? How do we relate to the Donald? I'm not going to read from it just now, but I have a poem called "Oh Donald Trump, Woe Donald Trump." And the closing part of it is, "Come home, Donald Trump. Come home to your mind. Come home to your people." That when you have people who are carrying historical trauma and acting it out in narcissistic behavior, the more you kick up about it, the more you feed that narcissism. Whereas if you start saying, instead of saying, "What have you done?" if you start asking, "What happened to you?" then you shift things onto the ground, potentially, of the prodigal son or prodigal daughter. I come finally to return. Campbell, like Mircea Eliade and other writers, point out that the return is a fulfillment of life. You've been through the harrowing, you've been through your departure. You're no longer just who your parents and community made you, because you've learned courage in the initiatory stages of life. You're now into return, and what that is about is bringing the flow of life back into the community. This is the task of the elder or the mentor. This is the shamanic function, the shaman who walks as one foot in this world, holding their act together in economic terms and practical terms, and the other foot in the other world, in the spiritual world. The old woman we just visited, she said to me, "Have you got the second sight?" In other words, do I have extrasensory perception? And I said to her, and Sarah's my witness, I said to her, you know, only people from the island would ask that kind of question, or from the west of Scotland would ask that kind of question. Because where we come from, it is accepted that you have this paranormal level of communication between people, because we are that close together in community. But when you lose community, you lose that distance. So in one of the articles I wrote about Donald Trump, called Donald Trump and the Second Sight, I point out that according to a late 17th century writer, when people from the islands went to America to become masters in slave plantations, because the Mackenzies held slave plantations, when that happened, those of them that had the second sight on the island completely lost it. I write about this in Poacher's Pilgrimage. And I say, why is that? In my view, it's because when you start doing violent things to other people, you break community, not just outwardly, but also inwardly. You break your own spiritual connection. You dehumanize yourself and cut yourself off from profound empathy. And that Donald Trump and the Second Sight, Donald Trump is like somebody who has not grown up with the opportunities for that empathy. And so he's kind of gone rogue. So I want to take you on a pilgrimage. I want to end with walking you on a pilgrimage. Those of you who are in Scotland have seen these slides before. Back to the Hebrides, the islands of Bridget, of St. Bride, who you see here being transported by angels on the night of the Nativity to be the foster mother of Christ, according to our legends. Back to places like Loch Tota Breagen here, because although we lost a lot of this with the Reformation, it's still there in the place names. Loch Tota Breagen, the lake of Tota, the ruin of Breagen, of Bridget, the Loch of Bridget's ruin. I used to fish in this loch. My bones are partly made from fish caught from that loch and its river, because our house was just down river from it. R.S. Thomas, a Welsh poet, had a line where he says, "The parish has a saint's name that time cannot unfrock." So although we've lost these traditions, they're still there in our place names. And so 10 years ago, I walked from the south of Harris right up to the north of Lewis, 60-mile walk as the crow flies. It took me 12 days going through treacherous territory and doing it meditatively. Some of you know about the mountain that I was involved in saving from destruction and being turned into the biggest roadstone quarry in the world. It's what I write about in my book, Soil and Soul. There's the mountain there. There is the medieval St. Clement's Church. That's where I started. I'm just going to walk you through this. Walking up through the Bays area of Harris, looking over there to the Isle of Skye. Walking and walking, bringing back memories of places I've always known, heading up for those mountains there, entering the pass between the mountains, 4 nights out alone, camping, not meeting a single person, walking and walking into what I came to think of as an ecology of the imagination. Because the distinction between the inner world and the outer world started to fuse. What did the old woman tell us just now? She said, when I was growing up, there was no distinction between nature and spirituality and people. It was all one. I wasn't expecting to hear that in Manhattan in a flat overlooking the Hudson River. But that's what we experienced this very evening. Walking and walking. Ancient dwellings. Loch Foshimid, which inspired J.M. Barrie of Peter Pan fame to write about the fairies. What did the old woman say? But her art is inspired from the Shia, the fairy world, the other world. Because in her worldview, that is the part of reality. The tiny island there is known as Mary Rose's Island because it inspired J.M. Barrie's play Mary Rose, about a little English girl suffering from war trauma and how escape to fairyland was part of the healing process. The weather closing in, navigating by map and compass, making my way across flooded rivers because I'm heading for St. Bridget's Shieling. And coming to this ancient sacred site, St. Bridget's Shieling, the parish has a saint's name that time cannot unfurk. Kneeling at the lintel stone there and watching the rain running down in runnels and observing how the sharp edges of the stone have rounded over time and reflecting on the hard line religion brought in and realizing you've got some sound effects in this place. And realizing that as the Lord said unto Moses, when you build an altar, build it with uncut stones, because cut stones profane my holy name. So kneeling at the altar of uncut stones and walking and coming to these ancient chapel sites in ruins, medieval chapel sites, in this case St. Peter's chapel site. And kneeling at the place where 400 Bibles were buried because they didn't know what to do with their old Bibles, so they buried them in their cemetery. And where human bones are exposed because you are here amongst the community of the dead, built on sand. And tears pouring down my eyes. And feeling that carrying stream of the flow of the ancestors. And there is nobody here, but everybody is here. And then some of you people turned up. And I took you to this ancient sacred site. And how do you relate to that hardline Calvinist religion, which is now expressed through the Free Church of Scotland? Except let's remember that the Free Church is the Free Church because it freed itself from control by landlords. So it's kind of changing from within. And the way we did it was we asked their permission to go there. And they said, let us take you. And would you like to come to our cafe for your lunch? And we were led by the formidable matriarch, Annie McSween. All present and correct. Do you remember that? As we'd get back onto the bus. And one of the elders led us in the singing of the 23rd Psalm. And then he said, would you like to come to the church and hear us singing in the Gaelic? And so we went to their free church, and there we all are. And they sang the 23rd Psalm in Gaelic. And then you people sang the 23rd or repeated it in, I forget how many different languages, but we had Spanish, we had Icelandic, we had Mandarin Chinese, we had our friend the Jewish rabbi and singing it in the original Hebrew, and it just blew them away. It just blew. If you go on the website, oh, I've not got the link there. Never mind. That's my last slide there. If you go on Facebook, you'll see Katrina Murray has posted the video of it being sung in the Hebrew. And somebody, in fact, Annie McSween has written on the Facebook, it was like Pentecost. It was like the breaking out of the speaking in tongues. And did you see what we did? Because you folk, if I might generalize, you folk from the Open Centre, you know, some of you are pagans and Wiccans and gay and, you know, all these things that kind of don't fit with hardline Calvinist theology. But we met each other, not at the level of the head, we met each other at the level of the heart, and hearts opened up that day, and the Spirit broke out amongst us, and people on the island are still talking about it. And thank you for inviting me here tonight to tell you that story of departure, initiation, and return, and how amongst ourselves we went on a pilgrimage of calling back the soul. Thank you. I understand we're billed for until 9:30, but some of you might have to get away, so please don't feel uncomfortable if you want to leave now or at any point. They have got both Poacher's Pilgrimage and Spiritual Activism in the shop downstairs, if any of you want to pick up copies of that while you're passing through. So feel free to take your leave at any point. And I'm very happy to open things up for discussion. The only thing is that if I might ask, if I just turn these on, and I'll be controlling them on my phone. There we go. If I can maybe put there we are. If you could hold the blue one on that side of the room, and the black one on this side. Or the other thing, would you mind being the runner and that'll keep it simpler. Okay, so we'll just use the black one. If I can take that one back, I'll switch it off and save battery. And I'll just make sure I'm turned on here. I think that's, yeah, there we go. So you just, when you're speaking, you don't have to hold it like that. You just hold it here. I'll alter your volume on my app here. The only thing that because I'm just so deaf, it doesn't work if people talk across each other. So if an argument, we can't have any arguments because so who would like to kick off? Anybody like to make a response or thoughts or points of disagreement or reflections? Memories, dreams, reflections. Yes, the lady there.
Is this okay? My volume okay?
Yeah, I'm just altering your volume. That's fantastic. Thank you.
I live in South Carolina and I work in New Jersey. I'm a poet and a teaching artist.
Ah, an honor to have you here.
Yes, and I've been doing this work for 26 years and coming to New Jersey for 11. And a friend of mine had hosted your talk here and I said I'm going to journey over because as you were talking, I was charting this path because I feel like this path I've been on, especially with my ancestors. If you think about the port of Charleston, and right before I came to New Jersey, I was in Charleston at the slave plantation McLeod.
McLeod Plantation.
Yeah, there's only two in America that tell the enslaved story, and so they're asking African Americans to come back to the plantation, which is some of the work that I feel called to do, my daughters as well. And standing in between the plantation and the slave quarters outside, doing poetry and feeling what that energy feels like in the low country and then going back up to where my family is in upstate. And then coming to New Jersey where people say, well, actually slavery didn't exist. Actually, New Jersey was the last northern state to let go of slavery. So we're doing a Lost Souls project there. And it seems like there's these places in the land that are holding, you know, this energy of lifting up the ancestors and giving them honor. And in the Low Country, they actually got a Yoruba priest in to take away the Anglo names of these people and give them rightful names. And then here in New Jersey, we're doing a project called Lost Souls and honoring 177 people and giving them names as well. And I feel like this is connected to the poetry and the outreach and us as, you know, humans, and me feeling as a young elder that this is the work to do and also talk to my community and also the young people so they understand this history that we're unearthing is theirs, so they won't feel disenfranchised. And know when you look in the textbook, you don't see your story, but the poets, the writers are mining those stories to bring you back so you can understand your connection. And I feel like it's a calling, and I feel it everywhere I go in different communities. And so I was very moved to be here tonight just because I feel very displaced with what's going on in the country. And it's lovely to talk to people who feel the spiritual activism, because I feel like that's where we're connected by the heart. And to talk to young people today who didn't want to read their poems, but then we say, you must speak, you must learn how to do this, to use your head and your heart. And then all of a sudden the hands go up and they tell their stories. So I want to thank you for your path, because I think we mirror each other when we speak our truths.
It's a particular honor to have you here and to say that. Do you know a man called Adi, is it Olufeni, is that his name, who runs the Woke Project and is president of the Gulaf Society?
No, I don't, the Gullah?
Gulaf, yeah, the Gullah, thank you. Gulaf.
It's okay. Does everybody know Gullah? Yes. Yes? Gullah is the, so when they brought us over from Africa, we came from very different countries. And so we had to find a language to speak to one another. And so we spoke a mixture of different African languages, and people speak Gullah today. My grandmother died at 109, spoke Gullah. And so if you listen, I am an Air Force kid, speaking of the military, that took my father out of the South, harsh South, and met her when I was 12, and she would speak, and I would not quite understand her. But that is what they call the second Middle Passage. Coming from the port, then my family moved up, and then Low Country is more Gullah, and the islands off of Georgia, South Carolina, and some of Florida is Gullah. But that's the root of the root, I would say.
So a year ago, I was in Charleston, invited to speak at the College of Charleston by Toddler Vasseur, who is one of my former students of human ecology. And he took me and introduced me to this man, Addy, who had put on an exhibition called Woke, which was about the lynchings.
Yes.
And he also took me out to MacLeod Plantation and across the road to that humble site where the ancestors of the slaves, or whether not the ancestors, where the slaves are buried. And Todd sent me a WhatsApp message just about a week ago. Let me see that, here we are. Here's the pictures of it. Here's, goodness me, here we are, saying to me, more of Addy's work, public procession to rebury unearthed remains of African-descended peoples. This is Saturday, 4th of May, he sent me this. Reburying exhumed African ancestors. You've got pictures of them there. African Americans and a few white folks mixed in amongst them. And it was Uncle Addy, a picture of Uncle Addy there, and reading out a video of reading out the names of the ancestors. I wonder if that will play. Can you hear this? Oh no, wait a minute, I'm on Bluetooth. I need to switch off my Bluetooth. See if you can hear this. Just a moment. This kind of feels important to honor this if we can get the technology to work. That was playing into my hearing aids just now, which wouldn't help the rest of you. Let me just turn it up and see if that will. Come on, please, please. And it's so powerful, you know, talking with Addy. I said to Addy, what work do we white people? And you know, some people find it offensive to speak of ourselves as white people, but that's the way it is. If we're going to speak truth, that's the way that we have to, or part of the way that we have to speak. What work do we need to do? And he said, remember your ancestors. Remember your ancestors. What work does Donald Trump need to do? Remember his ancestors. What work am I doing here in coming to speak about what I've been speaking about tonight? To encourage you, remember your ancestors. What happens when you remember your ancestors? When you remember your ancestors, you get drawn into what in Scotland we call the cultural carrying stream. That living river. That living river that flows from the past into the present and on into the future. And when you get caught up in that, you are caught up in that river that in Christian theology, indeed in Jewish theology based on the Hebrew Bible in Ezekiel, and then coming through into Christianity in the book of Revelation, you're caught up in that stream of living water that flows from underneath the temple. And along the banks of the river every form of tree, the leaves of which are for the healing of the nations. For the healing of the nations. Anybody else like to come in on this or on a different question? Thank you so much for being here and for sharing that. And I think in a lot of my work, I spent 4 years in Papua New Guinea. They're not African people, but in some ways there are many similarities with African people, including genetic similarities with the people of Madagascar from the South Pacific. And it was from those people that I learned about the importance of land. It was from those people I learned about reconnection of land with the spirits and so on. And when I came back from Scotland, that vision from Papua New Guinea was what powered me forward in being one of the pioneers of modern Scottish land reform. And so we now have a situation in Scotland where we have managed to bring back, since the 1990s, we've managed to bring back into community control through community land trusts 560,000 acres of Scotland, which is nearly 3% of the land surface. And we have land reform legislation. And that didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of studying Latin American liberation theology and black liberation theology. People like Steve Biko. And people like Steve Biko saying in one of his writings, the white man turned up with the Bible. And we looked at the Bible and said, yes, this is true. So we closed our eyes to pray. And when we opened our eyes, we had the Bible and the white man had taken the land. And understanding that is liberation theology. And understanding how the oppressed becomes the oppressor. So you get kicked off. Donald Trump's ancestors get treated the way they did. And as a consequence of that violence, you become desensitized. So what do? You go off and you colonize Native American territory, or you enslave black folks, or you build a wall with Mexico, or whatever it is. And so this is a deep work of what I call cultural psychotherapy. We all know what individual psychotherapy is. You understand your own history more so that you can make sense of your psychological suffering. And cultural psychotherapy is when we do the same on a collective basis. Yes, thanks. Thanks for using the mic, folks. But hang on a moment, wait a minute. I switched Bluetooth off. I just need to reconnect my gizmo. These hearing aids, the phone plays directly into here. So I had to disconnect everything for a moment. And which mic are you on? There, on mic 1. Speak.
Okay. I'm a little shaky because my grandfather was from Scotland, and I don't know very much about him at all, except that he came here. He was a Mennonite farmer.
Oh, a Mennonite from Scotland. That's unlikely.
Is it?
Yeah, we don't have Mennonites in Scotland.
Oh, well, maybe he took his wife. I don't know.
Yes, he probably came into it.
So
They're good people, the Mennonites. So he probably joined up with them.
So I have never really thought about my Scottish side at all.
Yeah.
So did I understand that the people were driven out of Scotland, and maybe that's why?
Well, they're driven out of some communities in Scotland.
Yeah.
So particularly in the Highlands and Islands. On our island, on the island of Lewis and Harris, it's called Lewis in the north and Harris in the south. On our island, probably about half of the island was subjected to clearances. So we call it the clearances. The evictions were called the Highland clearances. And so they were driven out. They were given notice to evict, and they were told that if they didn't go, they would be fined. And when they resisted, then the British state sent in gunboats with Marines and arrested them and threw them into prison. So in fact, all over the island now, we've got memorials. We've got beautiful, amazing stone memorials to the land, the people who resisted these evictions. We are reclaiming our history. Where are we getting that idea from? You know, we're getting that idea because we've got out of the island, we've traveled around the world, and we've seen what other peoples are doing to reclaim their histories. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, the international solidarity that's coming out of it.
Yeah, so my grandparents on that side, the Mennonites, of course, are conscientious objectors, do not go to war.
Yeah.
But I've always had this, like in my blood or something, I hate to say it, against the British. Not, I mean, we know about colonizing, but there's something inside of me that I haven't even really understood, and so I feel like something triggered tonight.
Well, read up about the Highland clearances, but be a little bit careful because, you know, basically I'm Scottish in that I was raised in Scotland and so on, but my mother's English, and I was actually born in England in a town called Doncaster, where my Scottish father, after graduating in medicine, went to get a job, and my mother was a nursing sister in the Doncaster hospital. And so, you know, one of the things that I do is that I'm quite sensitive about the feelings of English people so that they don't feel pushed into a corner. And so one of the things that I've been doing quite a bit in England recently is talking about the English enclosures. The same process where the English people were driven off the land. E.P. Thompson, the great English historian, calls it the making of the English working class. And I'm saying you can't understand things like the politics of Brexit just now unless you understand the way in which these people were treated by their own ruling classes who came in with the Norman conquest. And most of them don't know that history. They're not taught that history in their schools. Why not? Because it embarrasses power. So anything that embarrasses power doesn't get taught in the schools, otherwise it'll lead to insurrection and things like land reform happening. And you better not talk about that too loudly in Manhattan. Anybody else like to come in? Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
I actually was going to ask you about the clearances, but I would like to ask a little bit more because it was such a massive undertaking, and it ended up in Scottish people being shipped, immigrating to Canada, Australia, the U.S., and I just wanted to know how much of that ended up in the textbooks in Scotland and Great Britain after that had happened, and how much...
Oh, it didn't.
Not at all.
It didn't. It was wiped out. Indeed, you know, as late as the 1960s, leading Scottish historians, establishment Scottish historians, were saying, why is there all this fuss about the clearances? It was just a tiny bit of history, a tiny corner of history. They were trying to play it down. And it's only been since the 1980s that it's exploded into consciousness. 1970s and 1980s. Now, what happened in the 1970s and 80s were two things. First of all, you started to get a synthesis of our traditional Scottish music and modern rock music. So you had groups like Runrig from the Isle of Skye, and they started, you know, creating world music, basically. And in so doing, becoming conscious and speaking their own history. So I first started learning about these things by listening to the lyrics of a Celtic rock band. And then close on the heels of that, to mark the centenary of the passing of the 1886 Crofting Act, which gave security of tenure to the remaining tenants on the land, to mark that centenary, a number of historians started looking into this. And you had seminal books like The Making of the Crofting Community by Professor James Hunter, as he is now, which people like me then read, and it blew our minds. That was when I went to our school teacher and said, "Why didn't you teach us this stuff?" And I literally waved the book in front of him, almost accusatively. And the poor man, the poor gentle guy that he was, whose daughter I met the other day at an event, and I was telling her the story, he's dead now. The poor gentleman, we nicknamed him Cicero because he was a classics teacher. And he says, well, it was not in the curriculum. And in any case, we were ashamed of it. And that's what I find so interesting, that in order to do this work, you've got to overcome people's shame at multiple levels. You've got to overcome the shame of the poor at what has led them to be the underdog. But interestingly, and this is particularly relevant here in Manhattan, you've also got to overcome the shame of the rich, or just of the comfortably well off. You've also got to overcome that shame, because if we don't acknowledge where it is that we get, if I might speak for myself, my white male privilege from, if we don't acknowledge that, then we're not able to have an honest conversation. If my wife and I, we live in Govan, which is a hard-pressed area of Glasgow. We've got a nice house in a poor area, so don't imagine I'm talking about a hair shirt way of living, but we've chosen to live there because we're invited by the community there to come and live there and be involved in some of the work that I'll be talking about tomorrow when talking about urban poverty. But one of the first things that I will often do in talking with people when I meet them afresh in that community is that when the time feels right, in other words, not making a point of forcing it, but when it can come up naturally, I will acknowledge that I am from a middle class background, that I'm a doctor's son, that I've got a Ph.D. and an MBA and a BSc, etc. And I'm not rich, but I managed to scrape enough from doing this kind of talk and so on, and my books, to make a living of sufficiency but not excess. But I make a point of naming social class, of naming middle classness. And you can just feel people relax. We can trust him now. I go to College of Charleston and I meet people like Addie, and I confess my whiteness and my white privilege, and that our people also became slave traders, and so on. And that we're only discovering that now. And I just feel these African Americans relax in my presence. And I feel welcomed, I feel accepted. I have never once yet in my life, and I'm talking about, 4 years in Papua New Guinea and so on, I've never yet once been in a situation where I've acknowledged racial or class privilege and then had it kicked back at me. I've always found it forgivingly accepted. So we need to tell these stories to each other so that more of us start doing these things. Not making a fetish of it, not making a show of it, just, sensitively when the time is right, doing it, yeah. Just speak like that, yep. Okay? I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, I don't know where to begin here.
A little bit less close to your mouth, actually, a bit too loud, a bit further down, yeah. Yeah, that's lovely. Lovely, that's just, about there is perfect, yeah.
Don't want to do any harm. Many thoughts come to mind. I have maternal ancestry of 6th generation. I was in America, well, through Canada, but 6 generations away from Scotland. But I know quite a bit about my matrilineal line, and oh boy, there's so much. I just wonder how this painful chapter, I'm talking about April 16th, 1746,
Battle of Culloden. Yeah, the last battle on mainland British soil when the Highlanders were massacred,
well, what happened afterwards?
And the women raped, and the houses burned.
That's wrong, you didn't mention it, but it is really, it's what set many people to leave. Their lands were confiscated, and they
Yeah.
And recently, an Asian immigrant to Britain, I get this correct, a sculptor, made a sculpture of soap out of Cumberland, you know, AKA the Butcher.
All right, right. Out of who?
The liar.
Yeah, okay.
I
Cumberland.
can't remember the name.
Yeah, Cumberland or Hawley, one of them, yeah.
But he was,
Yeah,
he was
one of the
really
butchers.
honored with this soap
Okay,
sculpture of
right.
innovative.
To wash your sins away.
Another thing that's
Sorry,
going
let me just turn that down a wee bit at this end here. There we are. Thanks.
Thank you. Another thing that's going on is right at the battlefield area.
Yeah.
There's a housing development. And
There's a big battle about that, yeah.
Yes. I don't know what the latest
Yeah.
is on that. I have a
Yeah.
personal interest in this for many reasons I won't go into, but
Okay.
suffice to say,
Yeah.
my ancestors were on the losing side that day.
Yeah.
And so that's how I was sitting here. But I'm curious about also how are they teaching that in Scottish history book? I mean, they're all
Yeah.
British, so they have to have the same
Yeah.
textbooks.
Yeah.
And this history was taken literally right after the battle to Canada.
Yeah.
Nova Scotia,
Yeah.
and they kept it for generations. They also kept the language. My mother, who was like a
That's
first
right.
generation
Yeah.
away, could say a few words in
In
Scottish
Gaelic.
Gaelic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
was remarkable what they
Yeah.
managed to do, what they managed
Yeah.
to preserve with this culture. So, and they definitely knew who they were. They did the other naming thing where somebody would be called Charlie John Dan. That would be his name, meaning that's Charlie son of John. Son.
That's right, yeah.
They knew,
7 generations.
they knew, like that's how I know my whole
Yeah.
age. I mean,
Yep.
they just
Yep.
never forgot anything.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
I'm
right.
wondering how, when this history is your little boy growing up in Skye,
Yeah.
say, for instance, and you're reading the history book, the British history book,
Yeah.
about what happened.
No, we were ignorant.
What happened afterwards? Do they tell
We
the whole
we were
story?
ignorant. I mean, British imperial history that I had was that we were taught about the Black Hole of Calcutta and how the British had suffered in the Black Hole of Calcutta and how we had gone to civilize them and David Livingstone and all of that. That was what we were taught.
And nothing about the Scots that were shipped away?
No, nothing about that. Nothing about that.
Or the origin of the song?
Nothing
Go
about
take
that.
the high road,
You know,
go take
we.
the low road.
I mean, I could sing you a very racist song that we used to sing in the black of the school bus. The black of the school bus because it begins, Ali McAdoo, Ali, son of black. I'm not going to sing any more of it, but you know, these were things that we grew up in, and it was kind of like it's only been in the past sort of 30 years or so that we've really opened up and we suddenly realize, hang on, you know, we were raised with a white supremacist point of view.
Well, there's also an Anglo-supremacist point of view vis-a-vis the Scottish people. I mean, there's a
Indeed,
tremendous,
yeah.
prejudice there. Even in
Yeah.
God Save the Queen,
Yeah.
there was a stanza about the rebellious Scots.
There's all of that, and you know, I am acutely aware of what you are saying. This is why some of us are very passionate for Scottish independence. But what we have to be ever so careful of is that we don't stir up racial hatred in it. And so the Scottish government, the Scottish National Party, hinges on the idea that if you choose to live and settle in Scotland, you are considered Scottish. And so one of their captions is One Scotland, Many Cultures. And that many cultures includes English people who settle in Scotland, Irish settling in Scotland, Asians settling in Scotland, Scots Africans, and all the rest of it. In Scotland, there is a very active encouragement of the idea of multiple identities. So we'll talk of a Nigerian Scot or a Pakistani Scot. You go to a Pakistani wedding in Scotland, and the young guys are all wearing kilts. In the Pakistani.
I was at the George Hotel in Edinburgh the day the Brexit vote came through. And the people that were most disturbed about their futures
Yes.
were not native Scots. They were from, I don't know, Pakistan and Poland and all over the place.
Yeah,
It was very,
yeah.
very interesting we're talking about.
In Scotland, we voted 62% against Brexit, and we feel we're being dragged out of the EU. In Scotland, we have a strong sense of internationalism because we have learned, and you see this now, poets. You know, Hamish Henderson, one of our greatest poets, in the Freedom Come All Ye, one of our Scottish national anthems, one of the several Scottish national anthems, has a line, black and white, ein ither marriott. And we shall sing Scotland the brave, nae mair, nae mair. Now, if I can just unpack that, he's looking to a future where black people and white people to one another will be married. And no longer will we sing Scotland the brave as we go down the Broomielaw, as we go down the Firth of Clyde to be shipped off to fight for the British Empire. This is the consciousness that is happening in Scotland just now. This is what our artists, our writers, our poets and so on are working on. Nearly all of the creative people in Scotland are passionate about these issues. It's not something you'll pick up in the mainstream press because of how the press is controlled. But it's very alive there. Unfortunately, we only voted 45% for independence in 2014, and many of us feel broken by that tragedy because we wanted to show a different Scotland.
And didn't they do a public opinion poll later that it was higher than 45% in the second poll? It was just a public.
Well, there's been many polls since then, and it's now about 49, 51%. But I'm not going to get into that because it gets too complicated. For the politics of it get too complicated. The point I would want to take from it is that the idea that we must build our sense of belonging on an inclusive and not on a narrow ethnic identity. That is very strong in Scotland. The way that I put it in one of my poems is a person belongs in as much as they are willing to cherish and be cherished by this place and its peoples. The way that a Gaelic proverb has it is that blood counts for 20-fold, but fostership, adoption, counts for 100-fold. Or the way another proverb has it is the bonds of milk are stronger than the bonds of blood. In other words, what matters in making community is that we look out for one another.
Well, wasn't that the question in Scots Gaelic, to whom do you belong? And that's what they say. If you're asking who are you,
Yeah.
it's to whom do you belong?
Yes, it's right. That's right.
And so thinking about all that and wondering how you read a textbook, how you even know who you are, or do you belong to the British?
Well, it's awful. It's awful. I mean, when we look at those textbooks, it's horrific. You know, I would go as far as to say that when we become aware of these, many of us, I can't say for everybody, because some people are strong believers in the British Union and believe the British Empire was a force for good, and that Scottish soldiers did a valiant thing in holding it up. So you have to acknowledge that, you know, some people feel that. But many of us, and especially the creative people, and the people who are passionate about justice, we read that kind of stuff and we feel deeply wounded by the cultural abuse to which we have been subjected. And we feel deeply, I wouldn't use the word shamed, because I think we understand it more deeply than that. We feel deeply apologetic. We feel deeply humbled before people of colour, before black people, before Asian people, and so on, who our forebears abused after they themselves had been abused. And so in my work, I go around saying to people, we need to wake up, all of us, to how the oppressed become the oppressor.
Well, isn't that why they named it the KKK Klan, the Ku Klux Klan? There was a wonderful documentary where a young Scotsman goes through the American South and discusses with them
There we go.
their ancestry, and they're all,
Yeah.
a lot of them Scottish Americans. So
Scots-Irish. And I mean, my colleague Michael Newton, who is a leading Gaelic scholar, trying to find a job in this country because he's American, but there are no posts for Gaelic scholars in American universities. Michael's work just now, if you Google the name Michael Newton, his work is on the roots of white supremacy. Because what is the Fiery Cross? The fiery cross was the original rallying call when the clan was under threat. And it comprised a cross with two rags. One was soaked in blood and the other was soaked in tar and set alight. And a runner would run through the territory to warn the clan that it was under threat. Now, if I might simplify horribly, what then happened is that when Scottish people got kicked off the land or otherwise got subjected to economic pressure and so chose to migrate to America, and when they became masters in the slave, not usually the owners, sometimes the owners, like in MacLeod Plantation, but usually managers in the slave plantations. And so when they bought into the idea of black inferiority and white supremacy, and this sense of being the elect over a renegade people, when they bought into all of that, they took that sign of the rallying clans and used it in the KKK. It's tragic. It's horrible history. And I can tell you, even in Scotland, a lot of people don't want to face us, although now, and in recent years, we've started to have histories marking black culture in Scotland, marking slavery. You are actively having events where we're talking about this. We've got theologians like Ian White publishing books. One of his books is called Send Back the Money, about how we're on camera, so I don't want to embarrass the church concern, but one of the churches, and it wasn't the only one by any means, went collecting money for building its churches amongst Presbyterian plantation owners in the Deep South. And that led to a campaign to send back the money because it was tainted by slavery, but they chose to keep the money. But now you've got theologians writing books exposing all of that.
The saddest part.
It's beautiful.
The Scots themselves were sent as
Watching
slaves to plantations.
Watching the time. So I think folks, we'd better respect the time. We'd better respect the time because people are employed here and will need to be locking up. So we've opened up so many things, and thank you for being here to follow up on what we opened up with some of you when you visited our island. And all I can say is that, this is deeply about the holy work. This is about, forgive us for what we have done, and may we find the grace to forgive what has been done to us. If I might expand the Lord's Prayer like that. And this is the soul work of our time. This is how we call back the soul. And the strange and hugely beautiful thing about it that I learned first in Papua New Guinea and have since experienced from elsewhere is that when we have culturally been on the side of the oppressors, it is actually the oppressed that help us to call back our own soul. As Paulo Freire of Brazil puts it in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, the task of the oppressed is not just to emancipate themselves, but also to emancipate their oppressor, because only through the full humanization of all of us shall we be free. Thank you very much. Thank you.